The world faces multiple challenges that require a massive mobilization of resources. Sharing investment and risk through public-private partnerships, government entities, businesses, and civil society can deliver better services, solve complex problems, foster growth, and advance innovation. PPPs can leverage resources and increase impact. Engineering PPPs is a critical capability for all economies. Which new models could be used to share investment and risk? What best practices can accelerate the setup of PPPs? How can we drive innovation, sustainability, resilience, and inclusiveness via PPPs? With the Frame the Future conversation series, we are engaging corporations, nonprofits, government agencies, universities, entrepreneurs, and you. We are bringing forward 5 future-defining topics: innovation, partnership, sustainability, resilience, and inclusiveness. With each topic, we're bringing forward new ideas, sharing insights, and driving change. Join global leaders and us on August 25th to frame the future of public-private partnerships.
Hi, everybody. I'm Roberto Alvarez. I'm the Executive Director of the GFCC. Welcome. This is another of our Frame the Future conversations. The GFCC, it's a global multi-stakeholder organization. We have universities, corporations, government agencies, and private sector councils and organizations as members of the GFCC. Combining our members and fellows, we have a footprint in 30 countries today, and it's great to have you here today with us. Through the Frame the Future conversation series, as we just heard and watched, we are exploring how we can weave 5 future-defining topics into future competitiveness strategies: innovation, sustainability, resilience, inclusiveness, and partnership. We've been using those lenses to review a variety of competitiveness decision areas, themes that are critical for competitiveness policy. And we're here today to talk public-private partnerships. And I really want to invite you to be part of the conversation. So please feel free to share questions, to join the conversation at any moment using the Q&A feature here. We invite everybody also to share any resources that you think that would be valuable for this discussion. We have an amazing group of colleagues here today. We'll introduce them in a minute, but I really wanted to maybe take a few seconds to explain to you the flow of our conversation, and once again, invite you all to be part of that. So we are having an initial round here today involving our 4 guest speakers, and from there, we are delighted to have GFCC Distinguished Fellow Laurie Schmidt, that we'll introduce Laurie in a minute, leading the conversation that will follow. And then we will pull questions from the audience. So once again, please feel free to share your comments and your questions. Before we turn to our speakers, I wanted to invite GFCC President Deborah Winston-Smith to make a few remarks. Deborah, you've been working on public-private partnerships, seeing that from different perspectives, working for the government, working for private sector, driving a major organization today, not just the GFCC, but the Council in US. So over to you, Deborah.
Thank you, Roberto. And let me second Roberto's welcome to this very exciting discussion today on public-private partnerships through the lens of the 5 pillars of the GFCC Frame the Future series. I'm really delighted that our panelists today represent so many dimensions of this conversation. I know Roberto will do more formal introductions, but I just want to thank them individually, starting with our distinguished fellow, Laurie Schmidt, who did an incredible job building a major public-private partnership in Western Canada, and then across the country with Go Productivity in Canada, and was our fabulous host for the GFCC Innovation Summit in 2014 in Banff. So Laurie, thank you for your tremendous leadership and your accomplishments that you continue today. Also, I'm delighted that our colleague Anwar Burianbayev from Kazakhstan is with us. Anwar, again, will be introduced more formally, but he had been the CEO of Astana. He has played a major role in the incredible infrastructure that's been developed and deployed in Kazakhstan. And we had the great privilege and honor to be in both Nur Sultan and Astana in September 2019 for the GFCC Global Innovation Summit that Anwar played a leadership role in putting together and hosting. So Anwar, thank you so much for joining us. I don't know Professor Oliveira as well as our other two colleagues, but I will say that, you know, coming from where he has in academia and now working in strategic health at one of the major institutions in the state of Paribas is very exciting. And I know we're going to hear about those public-private partnerships. And then our new colleague, Professor Tapwa Shiwewi, who again is both a professor from academia, but obviously is at the heart of developing many of the digitization technologies and capabilities from AI to supercomputing, et cetera, in South Africa as the program director of IBM Research in South Africa. As Roberto said, I personally, professionally have been involved in public-private partnerships for literally my entire career. And I want to just signal a few issues that I think we're going to discuss today. First, I think we are on the cusp of a totally new era in public-private partnerships, that the models and the practices that we've developed really, certainly over the last 40, 50 years, but even going back farther than that, have reaped tremendous benefits in our respective nations, in innovation capacity, in developing new forms of energy, of course, in infrastructure, as well as in how we knit together sectors of the innovation ecosystem to really address huge complex problems that cannot be solved by one institution or one sector. And the risk tolerance for public-private partnerships, I think, is a major challenge, because whether it's that people in general are becoming less risk tolerant and not as resilient as other times in human history, I think we're dealing with a situation where there's some reluctance in nations to really marshal the forces they have to tackle and develop PPP solutions for these big both national problems, economic opportunities, and then societal problems. And without that, we're going to see, not the growth and the productivity and the societal development that we hope. I mean, obviously, we're going to talk a little bit about the PPPs that emerged during the COVID pandemic. And as we know, the vaccine development that occurred in warp speed, which is really an amazing accomplishment of medical science, manufacturing, deploying nanotechnology, genetics, et cetera. And then to be able to produce at scale these vaccines was a major public-private partnership. And that is something that really stands as a model for the future, because in that case, we had to assume risk, and we had to shorten the traditional linear process for drug design and approval, which has been in place, for many years. I want to mention, a couple public-private partnerships in the United States as an example in the innovation space. I had the great privilege and honor many years ago when I worked in the White House Science and Technology Office under President Reagan to actually write the briefing memo for the president for the approval of Sematech, which was one of the very early large-scale industry, government, university, and national lab partnerships addressing the whole challenges around next generation semiconductor materials and equipment. And that partnership played a huge role in transforming the semiconductor industry. Fast forward today, this is in mid 80s. Fast forward today, we have a huge global, and in the case of the US and other countries, national challenges around semiconductors. We know that there's a tremendous shortage. We know that there is tremendous underpinning of these critical components of our digital economies. And so whether it's in autos or in power generation, across every dimension of activity, semiconductors are really the heart, and they play an incredible role too, the advanced micro devices, as we move into the world of artificial intelligence and cognition. So we're seeing, again, in the United States, it's not a back to the future story, but it's building on this seminal partnership of Sematech. And then we are in the process of designing massive, at scale, public-private partnership for next generation semiconductors that will take us way beyond Moore's Law. And actually, this is a good example of bipartisanism, because in the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now in the Biden administration, there's all been a great commitment to this. And in our new infrastructure bill, the US Congress is allocating tremendous money to this, but it will include all hand players. It will include industry, large scale users, suppliers. It will include university. It will include national labs. And the other one I'll just quickly mention, because it's very much in the news, and it's very exciting. Some of our colleagues have had the opportunity to visit this, is the National Ignition Facility at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And just this past week, there have been announcements all around the world that NIF, as it's called, is very close to ignition, which means in effect that it will simulate a star on Earth. And the massive investment, this is a facility that's over the size of 2 US football fields. It brought together the best optic engineers. It brought together researchers. I mean, the whole building of it, the engineering, the design was an incredible public-private partnership. But it started with a vision. It had to have a design. It had to have support from the government. And it had to have the organizational structure to both build and execute something of this scale that had huge risk. Because for many years now, the naysayers have said, oh, NIF will never reach ignition. And of course, it has tremendous implications for the future of energy and power generation. So I just share those as a few very timely and relevant examples of the power, potential, and purpose of public-private partnerships. And so we're really delighted to have Lori Schmidt moderate this discussion after some initial remarks are made by our panelists, and have a great discussion. So thank you all so much for joining and for your leadership.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you so much for sharing, let's say, not just your thoughts, but some concrete cases that are really global benchmarks. And I think from what Deborah has said, there are two things that come to my mind. This notion that are at the core of public-private partnerships. One is, how can public and private sector share investment to tackle big issues and complex issues? And the other one really is about risk. Yeah, so I think, and I'll see that those will be two key topics for our conversation here today. Just to get started, we'll have an initial round, and I really want to briefly introduce, I'll make a few comments about our speakers. Deborah has mentioned them. Starting with Lori Schmidt from Canada. Lori is a friend and a GFCC colleague. You were there in the beginning, the early days of the GFCC, Lori. So thank you so much for being here. And Lori has been, I think it's fair to say, Lori, that you've been really an ecosystem builder, connecting public sector, private sector leaders, companies, universities in Western Canada, in Canada, and beyond. You co-founded and you led Go Productivity Canada, a nonprofit organization. You worked for the province of Alberta for being in public sector. You are leading women entrepreneurship initiatives in Canada, and you worked on a variety of things, including industry and cluster development, trade, economic development, strategic partnerships, and management. So wonderful to have you here, Lori. After Lori, we will hear from Anwar Burambayev. Great to be here. Great to be with you again, even virtually, Anwar. I think that the last time when some of us met, we were in Astana and Almaty with you. We had the GFCC Global Innovation Summit in Astana or in Nur Sultan. Anwar is founder and partner for the Center of Research and Consulting. It's a think tank based out of Astana in Kazakhstan. He also is the head of the Center for Competitiveness at the International Scientific Center of Astana. As I said, Anwar worked for the city of Astana, designing city competitiveness strategy, and also at the government of Kazakhstan in industrial development, and also has consulted with a variety of companies in oil and gas, banking, mining, and other in verticals. So thank you for being here, Anwar. Joining us from Johannesburg, we have one of the global leaders of IBM Research, Tapiwa Chiwiwi. Tapiwa, wonderful. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. IBM Research is, as we all know, it's a leading research facility in the world, being part of the IBM Corporation. Dr. Chiwiwi is a senior researcher and director for IBM Research. He works on applied AI, AI in general, core AI technologies, and quantum computing. He was one of the leaders for the IBM 2021 Global Technology Outlook. And you've been weaving on the ground partnerships and public-private partnerships, not just in South Africa, but in the continent. So thank you so much. And for those who know a bit about IBM, Tapiwa has received an Outstanding Technical Achievement Award, and he's a professor at the University of Western Cape too. So wonderful to have you. And finally, joining us from Brazil, we have Eduardo Oliveira. Eduardo, thank you. It's great to be with you again. Eduardo and I go a long way back. We worked together in one of our previous lives. So Eduardo is a professor and one of the leaders for the Center of New Technologies for Health, Strategic Health Technologies in the State University of Paraíba in Brazil. The university is one of our GFCC members and is our GFCC university member in Brazil today. Until recently, he was a visiting professor at the University of California, San Diego. But Eduardo has been working with public-private partnerships in the health space for several years. He was a director for the Industrial Complex and Innovation at the Ministry of Health in Brazil. He also was a director for a company that the Brazilian government has put together to manage several hospitals that are operated by public universities in Brazil. So Eduardo comes with an amazing background in health technologies and working in public-private partnerships in the health space. So we'll have an initial round of comments really talking about how can we drive what works and what doesn't work in public-private partnerships. How can we use public-private partnerships to advance innovation, sustainability, resilience, inclusiveness? And to get it started, I want to invite you, Laurie, for your initial remarks. And I will invite each one of our speakers. When we finish, I'll leave it to you to lead the conversation. So Laurie, over to you.
Great. Thank you so very much, Deborah and Roberto, for your leadership of the GFCC, how innovative you have been during this time, including the Frame the Future series, which has been so insightful, and also for your kind words. You're always inspiring and vision casting of what can be, and I always get so much joy and inspiration from that. So I'm going to start off and set the stage a little bit, just for a little bit of understanding. Public-private partnerships really involve collaboration between government agency or agencies and private sector entities that can be used to finance and build and operate projects such as public transportation or schools, hospitals, parks, major public facilities, and so on. And they're being used more and more for major infrastructure projects that have more complex components and higher risk. In Canada, we call them P3s. They're not new. They have significant advantages, and they also have their challenges, but they're very much re-emerging in today's landscape. As was mentioned, I've been involved in a number of P3s in a number of different types of sectors, but primarily within transportation and major industrial construction projects, and now wading more into social impact projects. The main purpose of PPPs is really to encourage innovation, collaboration, appropriate risk sharing with the private sector, and draw on the varied expertise and strengths of both the public sector and the private sector. Another purpose is really, how do we value, really maximize value for money? And through that, we consider life cycle costs, opportunity for third-party provision for some of those ancillary services, such as maintenance or food or expertise. It allows for optimizing of risk allocations, opportunities for third-party revenue, and creating other value for the community or the region that these initiatives will take place in. And ultimately, it's enhancing the ability to deliver projects on time and on budget. So now let's consider infrastructure is aging, the national deficits are growing, the tax revenue is taking a hit from COVID-19. Many countries and communities are wondering where they're going to find the funds to provide basic services to the residents, let alone address deferred maintenance on infrastructure projects. So those conditions, along with the future of digital transformation, the needs of massive ICT infrastructure anywhere, but especially in remote regions, are providing an opportunity for many to consider a new emphasis and maybe new models around PPP. There's optimism as these being a key to future development. And there's a huge opportunity to leverage resources and foster innovation that have greater impact through these collaborative models. Also, we're seeing that there's more and more those who recognize the need to apply these methodologies and these new models around PPPs that take into consideration and link specifically to sustainable development goals. We're seeing more of that being built into the models, the consideration of resilience and inclusiveness. And all of this calls for different forms of partnerships, not only to close the infrastructure gap, but to focus on advancing significant innovation projects and tackle the large issues that we are facing together as societies. What I really want to pull out from a very massive topic, and I'm so excited to hear from my fellow panelists, their knowledge and their experiences. But first, I think to achieve a higher level of success, PPPs need to focus as much on or more on the relational components of the model as it does the transactional and contractual pieces of the project. So building trust and openness to work through differences and interests openly and honestly throughout the project. How are we going to handle those challenges when we come across them? Building better overall partnerships. Keeping the working relationships of all parties strong throughout the process is really what we're seeing will lead to success. Building in more almost strategic alliance type architecture for greater success and impact, that vision casting that Deborah mentioned as well. And we've begun to see this shift of approach in major construction projects in Canada, which has really started to show some amazing results. Second, I know that we'll hear more about this in a few moments from our panelists as well, but there's huge opportunities to focus beyond the traditional, transportation and facility infrastructure, particularly into digital. So we know that digital transformation needs ICT infrastructure to succeed, and policy development needs to be part of that conversation. And particular, digital and red tape and outdated policies often make it difficult to implement. Digitization also can improve citizens' access to services. It can improve the lives of our people. And this is an opportunity to approach the major challenges that we're facing as a society around health, technology, climate, food sustainability, education. It's very endless. And all of these are huge for us as countries and societies today. And finally, in that same vein, I just want to close off with one more thought, is that I think there's a new opportunity for a new focus on public purpose as well. So partnerships where public purpose is a fairly new phrase that's emerging, clearly defining the public purpose and potential impact of the project, and then proceeding to define overall deliverables, roles, responsibilities. But what's the public good? So the idea, of merging methodologies for greater social impact as well as financial project sustainability, I believe is really the future of where we can move to the next level. So with that, I'm excited to hear more from our panelists and engage with them with conversation. And I will pass it along to hear the next summary comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you for, let's say, this three fundamental topics really focused on the relationship, the relational component, building trust and openness. So I think the question is, how can we do that? So wonderful. Second thing, expanding the horizons and including other topics, and also aiming high, having a public purpose in mind. So thanks for sharing that. And Laurie, one thing that I remember from working with you in the past was really your work in connecting innovation, industrial development, business development with major infrastructure and energy projects and PPPs in Canada. So I'm sure you come and we'll tap on that when we go forward. So let me turn to Anwar. Anwar, we were talking the other day about what works and what doesn't work. You've seen public-private partnerships in different contexts, city level, national level. So what's your take?
Hi, everybody, dear colleagues and participants. It's my pleasure to be a part of this discussion. First of all, let me give just a few key facts about our country, because it is reflect to our focus of PPP. Kazakhstan is a Central Asia country, part of the former Soviet Union. Country is intent in the world by territory, but only 64 by population, with slightly more than 19 million people. Density is very low, and around only 6.3 people per square kilometer. So the country is rich in oil and mineral resources, bordering with the largest economies of China and Russia, and with three Central Asia states. There are around 89 cities in the country, however, most of which are small or single industry towns. It's just because of our mineral resource orientation. The bulk of our urban population lives in just three largest agglomerations. Country is very different in terms of economy development. We have a very poor and relatively populated area in agriculture south. The east and center part are focused in heavy industries, oil-rich west, and agriculture north. And two main cities with post-industrial structure of economy. The country is young, a quarter of population is under 14 years of age. Almost 40% are under 25. GDP per capita at purchasing parity around 26,000 American dollars and just above 9.5 thousand nominal dollars. So all of these set of these factors create our idea about how to use PPP. Due to long distance, low density, and ongoing migration to the major city, the country faces the challenges of the infrastructure gaps in transportation, in digital infrastructure, in utilities in the main cities, and also in social facilities. This is, for us, a key sphere for attracting investments through the public-private with this instrument in the beginning of our independence in 1991. It was like we traditionally start from law of concession, and then in the middle on 2010, in 2014, we create a new law about the PPP. Today we have more than 1,300 projects implemented in the country in the 9 sectors of our economy, and almost 3/4 accounted in the social sectors related to education, health, and social service. We were going very fast. So what lessons we have learned from our experience? First of all, unfortunately, the desire for quick wins makes a cruel joke of us. In order to stimulate investment attraction and raise the number of projects, we changed the criteria of PPP definition, and we really extend the understanding of PPP. It was related with duration of the project and the type of instruments. Most of the projects do not meet the key criteria for PPP in terms of duration, and as a result, almost all projects in social sectors was like a management contract. It is our bad thing. However, PPP is a double-edged weapon. We have a very positive experience. The implementation of PPP, just one of example how PPP can create an innovation and how PPP could be used in order to raise the local innovative company. As you remember, Roberta and Deborah, when we discussed in Astana, in Nur Sultan, how the PPP project on traffic control system in our capital between our municipality and local tech company created a strong local player with the competence in the visual recognition and the urban traffic management. Now, this company has begun scaling up to our major cities and start to export this decision to the other Central Asia countries. This is, for my opinion, this is the excellent example of how PPP can create innovation. Another good example is Nazarbayev University. It's also a very positive and ambitious kind of PPP project with the government investment and the management from the non-government educational fund. And EU is a successful example of how to bring Western academia and research standards into the developing countries. I don't know, maybe you heard about the first unicorn from Kazakhstan. It is Caspi, which is a fintech company. It is also could be recognized as some PPP project because now Caspi is a deeply integrated in terms of providing some public service such as paying tax, paying for utilities, etc., etc., etc. So right now the market cap of Caspi more than $20 billion. It is amazing in terms of size of our economy. Just for example, GDP of Kazakhstan in nominal dollars and slightly more than $180 billion. So market cap of Caspi, 20 billion. That's amazing. Now PPP, we start to more focus on PPP, especially in the pandemic period, because right now the new criteria to the education environment forced us to very quick raise the number of the school classes. And right now, there are a very large project is being implemented to build school in the two largest cities where we have a tremendous shortage of the classes. So what is the next? What is we're going forward, and right now, my opinion, after the Kazakhstan joined the United Nations in its initiatives about the Sustainable Development Goals, our state policy about the PPP will be redesigned in order to achieve these standards. PPP can and should be a strong tools in this process. We have, and my main ideas is that the PPP policy should be redesigned in order to transform PPP to the real impact investment instruments. It's very interesting and ambitious goal. As ambitions above our country priorities will be closely linked to our needs to close the deficits of public goods. Moreover, the solutions to the pandemic of scarcity should be carried out through the use of technologies and solutions that will ensure the sustainable provision of public goods on the one hand and create demand for innovations for the local companies on the other hand. Areas very broad: healthcare, education, access to utilities and clean energy, and how to transform our cities into the safe and comfortable place of living. In addition, it's very interesting opportunity to use PPP in some indirect way. It will be possible to consider a PPP as an instrument beyond the public goods. However, where the government have some shortage. Just for example, in our country, it is industrial and logistic infrastructure, some affordable housing, reclamation and irrigation of agriculture land, and etc. So direct and indirect way how we can use the PPP approach to develop the social and economic sphere of our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anwar. The way I heard what you said is that there are two kinds of examples, one coming from the public to the private, and the other one from the private to the public. And you gave, let's say, examples related to, let's say, coming from the private to the public. You mentioned Caspi, and thank you so much for mentioning that amazing case. But also, the other thing that I took note here is this: your concept that PPP should more and more become like an impact investment framework. I think that's very innovative. So thanks for sharing that. Tapiwa, I would like to turn to you for your initial remarks. And you've been in Africa working for a global corporation, working and leading initiatives within this global framework that IBM Research has, but working with several governments, not just in South Africa, but with other governments to advance research and innovation. So we would love to hear about your experience in doing that.
Sure. Thank you, Deborah and Roberto, for the invitation. Thank you, Lori, for moderating this panel. I'm happy to be here with my fellow panelists. So maybe just to begin, let me just mention that, I'm a member of IBM Research, and PPPs have been a core part of the operating model of IBM Research from the very beginning. So in 1945, we actually set up the first IBM Research Lab which was the Watson Scientific Computing Laboratory at Columbia University. So we had a collaboration with Columbia University. If you fast forward, 10 years later in 1955, when we're looking to set up a research footprint outside of the United States, we looked at many countries in Europe, and eventually what tipped the scale was when we took a look in Switzerland, and they had, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, who we could potentially partner with. And we did eventually set up the first lab outside of the United States in Zurich, and we've been collaborating closely with ETH Zurich over the years. And this is a model that is endured over time. So, for example, I'm based in South Africa, and I'm part of, the Africa Lab. And the Africa Lab is co-located between Nairobi, Kenya, and Johannesburg, South Africa. Now, the location in Nairobi is right next to the Catholic University of East Africa. And in Johannesburg, we are next to Wits University, which is one of the leading universities on the African continent. So this is a model that we followed right from the very beginning, and it endures right up until this very day. So, when choosing a location for a research lab, there are different drivers like the regulatory environment, the sort of infrastructure and so forth. But I think for us, in terms of locating it close to a research institution or a university, it's really about having access to a talent pipeline, but also considering us as an innovation company, right? We've had like some 6 Nobel laureates. We've had so many innovations that have shaped the modern world. And as a result of the sort of activities that we do, we actually create new markets. And as you create these new markets, you need to have skills that can support those markets. So that's where this sort of model that we're following also helps us to develop the skills to support the markets that we are creating. Now, in South Africa, in addition to us having these collaborations, for instance, with Wits University, the establishment of the lab was actually a result of a public-private partnership between the government and IBM. So this PPP, the purpose of it is to actually further the RDI roadmap, the Research Development and Innovation Roadmap of South Africa. And this actually ties to this whole idea of the importance of innovation, particularly as it relates to economic growth, international competitiveness, and societal well-being. So if we were to take a step back and go back in history, in the United States, we know that post-World War II, there was Vannevar Bush, and he actually authored a report called Science, the Endless Frontier. And this was all about helping to form a formalized pipeline, an innovation model where the government invests in basic research at one end, and this passes through in universities, research institutes that advance research and training, and flows out at the other end in the form of technology creation and new products that are developed and productized, within the private sector. And we have seen, the value of such a model, thanks to the partnership between government, academia, industry, backed by federal funding. The US has produced a stellar record of scientific advances. It's invented revolutionary technologies, such as the digital computer, GPS, integrated circuits, and so on, creating new markets, industries, and companies. And us as IBM, we have participated in, some of these PPPs as part of a national system of innovation. So, for example, you could take a look at the Apollo program, helping to land a man on the moon. We're part of that collaboration. Or more recently, so for example, I know Deborah was talking about the semiconductor industry and the semiconductor shortage. So recently, in terms of innovation, we created a 2-nanometer process for manufacturing semiconductors, and we are partnering with various other industry players as well as governments towards the formation of a national semiconductor technology center in Albany and New York. And this sort of participation in a national system of innovation is something that we are doing across the world, through our different research labs. So, for example, here in South Africa, we've been partnering with the SKA, the Square Kilometer Array Consortium, which is a big mega science project which is funded by many different governments. So we actually had a collaboration with the SKA. Similarly, we had a collaboration, for example, with the National Cancer Registry, taking a look at how we can lessen the amount of time it takes to report cancer statistics, and various other collaborations across various domains. So I think the key for us when we enter into these sort of public-private partnerships is that we seek to bring the best of what we can offer. So if you think about SKA, this is a partnership that's focused on radio astronomy. If you take a look at the National Cancer Registry, this is about pathology and oncology, but we don't necessarily have that sort of domain expertise. But we do have key expertise in certain technology areas around artificial intelligence, quantum computing, security, hybrid cloud, and so forth. And that is our value add when we enter into these sort of public-private partnerships as part of advancing a national system of innovation. So that's what we bring to the table, and that also helps in terms of sharing of responsibilities and de-risking, because we're focusing on what we're good at and so forth. And I think, just as a final comment, in some time ago in IBM, we did a study particularly focused on research and development and innovation, and we actually showed through this study that when there is some sort of collaborative RDI, the companies that participate in those sort of activities actually outperform their competitors in their industry. So I think there needs to be more of this sort of collaboration, more public-private partnerships, and also doing it in an open way. So open innovation, open science, I think there needs to be more of that going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Tapiwa, for highlighting what is in your DNA, or highlighting that PPPs are in your DNA. But also, I think that you made a very important comment here. It's my take that you need to clearly map the different pools of expertise that are needed when you go into a PPP to see the type of collaboration that you have. So thank you so much for sharing that. And you also mentioned two things that touch upon some of the things that we've been doing in the GFCC. So I'll share a link here with colleagues in attendance, because we in the GFCC, we mapped different models for universities to engage with corporations and governments. And also we did a benchmark of extreme technology projects, including SKA. So we had a chance to talk with the leadership of SKA and pull some lessons. So I'll take the liberty of sharing with colleagues here the link for those who want to check more about that. Eduardo, I would like to turn to you. You've been, for sure, you are at the university, and that connects well with what Tapiwa has just mentioned, but you led critical initiatives in Brazil. And the whole thing about sharing risk between government and private sector, my take is very difficult in an emerging country like Brazil. So what works and what doesn't work in public-private partnerships?
Hi, Roberto. Hi, Deborah. Thanks for the GFCC for the invitation. It's a great opportunity to share some knowledge and some information with you regarding this theme. I mean, when you're talking about innovation in health in Brazil, especially when you're talking about a country which has the largest public health system in the world, we're talking about a free public health system for 210 million inhabitants, and 75% of our inhabitants relies on this public health system. Just to give you some numbers, when you're talking about R&D activities in Brazil, 30% of all the R&D activities relay on health technology or on the health thing. We have 10% of all qualified workers in Brazil are working in the health sector. 10% of our GDP relies on the health sector. And when we historically look at our trade balance, right, our deficit related to health technology is increasing, and it is increasing fast, even though we had for a a reasonable window, some policies related to the stimulation of health tech production in Brazil. Nowadays, we are talking about $12 billion in debts related to health technology, and 50% of those $12 billion relays on high-tech devices or high-tech products. You know. In 2008, the government starts to think out of the box, and instead of only making PPPs for traditional infrastructure like roads, railroads, airports, ports, the government set up a project and a strategy in which you had historically in Brazil for medicines, public producers for vaccines, for instance, like Fiocruz Foundation, like Butantan Foundation. Those institutes had the knowledge, had the basic knowledge to produce those medicines, and we had a very increased and a very big demand for the public health system. So how to combine this situation, how to combine demand, how to combine technology, how to combine production, and how to internalize those knowledge and keep that knowledge in the country in the long term. So the idea was to set up a law through the Brazilian innovation law. It's relatively very recent. It's from December of 2004, and it started to be implemented in 2006. And the idea was, look, I have a demand as government. We have a technological basis here in our R&D institutions, and we need partners who has knowledge and the infrastructure and the ways to transfer that knowledge to our institutions in a mid-term partnerships between 5 to 10 years. And through this process of tech transfer, the government was guaranteeing the purchase of the device or of the product, you know. So we were paying the tech transfer through a window of 10 years, while our institutions in Brazil was receiving knowledge, receiving technology, and in most cases, setting up production lines of that, what we call the strategic health device here in the country. What worked and what didn't work in this kind of scenario? First of all, when you're talking about here in Brazil and regarding the legal framework of Brazil, especially when you have money allocated in public institution and that public institution has to operate the money to do something, you know. If your public-private partnership relies on the public money going through another public institution, that public institution has to make the bureaucratic procedures to use the money in order to build something. This is going to be a gap. This is going to be a high-risk procedure because there are procedures in the public system that must be followed, and that time of those procedures sometimes do not match with the time of a tech transfer project. So in some case, what we observed is that when we make a contract in which all the investment is relied on private money, and we have this partnership, this will flow easily because you have in the contract very clear what are the frameworks, what are the real demand, what are the obligations, what is the amount of investments that you need to run that product for 5 or 10 years, okay? You have the role of the public, the private company, the role of the public company, what kind of elements, what kind of deliverables will be given from the private company to the public company. And it's very clear, in any case, it must be clear in any kind of contract how much is going to be the reimbursement, how much you're going to be paid for that. Because here in Brazil, there is it's not a law, but I mean, there is an understanding from the official agencies responsible to monitor the expenditure of public money that it doesn't matter if it's a tech transfer, project. in every single purchase that you're gonna make, you have to check if the price of the product is comparable to what they call a market price. Let's suppose as a public entity, we start to develop something with a private company, we start to sell this for $100. And at some point of this project, at some point of this tech transfer process, the price of this device drops 50%. Someone will ask me to drop my price 50%. Doesn't matter how much investment I made in the early beginning to have this product reaching the Brazilian market. So this is a kind of gap that must be, everyone must be aware when you're talking about PPPs for tech transfers, for instance. But I believe that with this new scenario for health in Brazil, and unfortunately induced by the pandemic of the new coronavirus, I see that this kind of cooperation, this kind of product can still on, especially when you're talking about the management of health service like hospitals. The hospitals are suffering from high demands of products. They must modernize their logistics. They must modernize their supply chain. So this can be a very good opportunity. And also in the medtech sector, especially regarding medicines and antibiotics, for instance, it's going to be a very big issue in the whole world. So people must be aware of the lack of this kind of technology in the next 5-10 years. IVD device, in vitro device for diagnosis, medical device, and with the incorporation, I would say now, infrastructure of the 5G, this can be a very opportunity for new business models in health, especially relied on management, health data, health strategy, prediction, and horizon patients and disease horizons in the future. So, I mean, there are very great opportunities for the health sector in the next years. I think the legal framework in Brazil related to PPP, it's a good framework. It must be clarified, but those clarifications might be discussed in a public bid or in the contract, for instance, and it must be very clear what is the basis for this PPP, what are the deliverables, what are the allocation of risks between public and private entities, and mainly, what are the reimbursement rules in the following years?
Thank you, Eduardo, for highlighting the importance of engineering PPPs, and I think that this whole issue about the pricification of R&D efforts, how do you put a price on that, and how could you cover that when you're developing something new? Laurie, over to you. We have several questions. Feel free, I would be happy to support when needed to pose some questions.
Yeah, Roberto, I was wondering just where the conversation is led, if we might take a couple of the questions that are in the Q&A right now as an open to our panelists. They're along the similar vein right now.
Sure. So let me maybe review the 3 questions that we have here and put them on the table. So we have a question from Cartini that really is, in order to achieve a successful PPP, there should be a careful analysis of long-term development goals and risk allocation. Yeah. So he asks about what kind of legal and institutional frameworks are needed for that to support new business models, and how can we assure the effective governance of PPPs. So frameworks, really how to establish goals and work on governance schemes. Then our friend and colleague Walid Al-Somali from Saudi Arabia, from Saudi Aramco, is once asking about governance and overseeing PPPs. How do we do that and what's needed? And also metrics. How do we measure performance and the impacts of PPPs? And finally, Tatiana is asking about if we should have PPP authorities, and say, hey, in PPP should it be just another market player, or follow in a different scheme, right? Or follow special standards. So governance, how to measure progress, and what type of institutional setup is needed.
Great. So I don't know if there's someone that wants to step into one of those, but perhaps as I ask you a couple of general questions, you will keep those in mind around metrics, around framework, around entities, because those are common to all of the PPP situations that we're thinking about, but keep them front and center. Anwar, if I could step back to you for a moment and call on you. I was privileged to have attended the GFCC Innovation Summit in 2019, just before the pandemic hit. And we were so wonderfully hosted by your country. And I was astounded at the development and innovation and fast growth. Now, you've given us some good examples around, the new PPPs that are emerging. You talked a little bit about those impacts around urban transportation and innovation. And you began to highlight that new generation of tech startups in Astana that you're really starting to focus on with a number of relationships. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about those, and maybe a little bit of how they're structured. What is that framework? And that will help tie in some of those other questions that we've had from our audience.
Thank you for your question. It is I have to say, you see our new capital, Astana. It was all kind of big PPP projects between the government and the transnational and the local oil companies and some mining companies. Because to build such kind of city in the so short period of time, it was a very, very ambitious project. However, we do it, and I want to answer to all participants who make a question. First of all, my personal opinion, in order to achieve the success with PPP project, we need to have a clear understanding what is our goal. Because sometimes it's what I say in the beginning, like a quick wins, sometimes became like main ideas in the government official. So we have instrument PPP, we have some needs. Let's go to make collaboration with the private, but at the end of the day, it could be like just not pure PPP, because all risk will be transferred to the government side. My second belief that PPP project is not about to build some infrastructure in more cheap way in terms of finance results, because it's we need to understand the cost of money, real cost of money. We need to understand the cost of risks, etc. But what we should understand in context of the developing country, sometimes PPP give us access to the latest technologies and innovation, because sometimes it's very difficult to buy knowledge and buy innovation. So what is why I mention the sustainable development goals created by United Nations, because it is a very big initiatives, and they have a special team. For us, it is Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. And this team create like a country guidance how to implement these sustainable development goals to the PPP model, how to redesign it, how to engineer PPP approach in order to achieve the sustainability, resilience, and bring some innovation. So this is my answer to your question.
That's great. Thank you very much, Anwar. You brought up a couple of really critical points, and that is, first and foremost, it's what is the goal? All partners need to be really clear and have that at the centerpiece before building out all those other pieces. And you went on to say that lots of instruments or lots of pieces to be able to put PPPs in place. But one of the hiccups can be that risk allocation. And one of the questions I think that many look at is, how is that appropriately allocated throughout the life of the project, right? And understanding that cost of money throughout the life, of a project. I really like that you brought out the fact that PPEs really give access to the latest technology and innovation, and that's a really great thing to build upon. And then in terms of the sustainable development goals, it's kind of forcing us to look at PPPs in new ways, and forcing us to be able to build these out in more innovative ways. So thank you really very much for your response there and your input. If I can switch to Tapua, I'd like to call on you. There's a number of things with your experience, particularly in the technology field. But I'm really interested in, I think I'd referenced you earlier as we were preparing for today, that a recent article caught my attention because it discussed the point that for Africa, not just to survive the current impact of the pandemic, but really to thrive, investment in digital infrastructure is critical. And although it's not a new conversation for any of us, of course, the pandemic kind of abruptly accelerated that need for digital adoption. And so I'm wondering, how, especially given budgetary constraints and lots of significant investment that's required, how do you see public-private partnerships playing a role in accelerating digital transformation? How do you see that unfolding?
Sure. So I think in terms of coping with the pandemic, I think there are two sort of dimensions which are kind of like front of mind for me. So one has to do with, how do we come up with the new therapeutics and prophylactics for COVID-19? And then the other dimension has to do with, how do we remain productive given the sort of disruptions that we're seeing from the pandemic. Last year in March, when the pandemic was gaining steam, we actually put together an organization called the High Performance Computing Consortium, and this was done in the space of just a week. And the idea was to match researchers who needed computational resources with organizations that actually provide these resources. So within a very short space of time, we're able to get some 43 consortium members, and very quickly there was some 91 active projects, and a massive amount of computational resources were pooled together and made available. We're talking about some 600 petaflops, 50,000 GPUs, 6.8 million CPU cores. So this was a massive amount of computational resources that were made available. And I think what this points to is that particularly when we're talking about innovation, the nature of innovation is changing today. So innovative research in most scientific fields today, they actually require complex facilities and cutting edge technologies. And this often translates to high costs, particularly for these large scale, long-term projects. So to reduce costs and to share risk, as well as augment scientific expertise, I think major collaborations are becoming more and more common, such as what we've seen with this HPC consortium. So turning back to Africa, in as much as this consortium, it was, the resources were made available to people worldwide, anyone could apply. But then the same principle applies for us here in Africa. So definitely there needs to be access to technological infrastructure. And there also needs to be skills to actually enable technology transfer in cases where it's desirable. So for example, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we know there's a problem of vaccine access in certain regions of the world, such as in Africa. And there have been certain initiatives to set up some vaccine hubs on the African continent to, for example, manufacture or maybe just fill and finish the Pfizer vaccine, of which that requires there to be some base of skills for you to be able to do that sort of technology transfer. So I think there has to be more in terms of the skills through public-private partnerships. So for us as IBM, we've got a presence on the continent. So when it comes to some other technologies, like for example, quantum computing, we can actually facilitate that technology transfer. And this is something that we're actually doing. We're actually helping to create a workforce across the African continent that is actually up to speed with quantum computing technology. So I think there needs to be more of that, more access to infrastructure and more development of different skills. Back in the day when people were doing, their scientific research, someone could just download some data, have it on their laptop and, do some research. And if someone was part of a large institution which had sufficient capital budgets, they would have some sort of high performance computing cluster on site. But then, not all institutions have that sort of capital budget. So I think today, if there can be some sort of federated infrastructure where you pull together resources across the continent, this will enable people to actually do this sort of innovation work. And similarly, because there are lots of concerns nowadays around sovereignty of data and security and that sort of thing. So I think this is where there can also be some public-private partnerships, whereby some people may have some infrastructure that they have on site, and then they can partner with commercial providers, like commercial providers of cloud computing, and they can have some sort of gateway where people can burst and access some of these commercial cloud resources, and also make use of their own on-site resources. So I think these are the sort of investments that would be really beneficial to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic, in terms of coming up with new solutions, as well as adapting to the future of work that we are faced with because of all these different disruptions that we are seeing.
Deborah, I think you wanted to respond, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond to some of the great responses to our colleagues here and build on this issue that Eduardo raised first, and others have chimed in on the whole regulatory environment that either acts as an incentive or a set of tangled barriers to both the development and deployment of PPPs across many purposes and sectors. And the regulators, who are very important in government agencies in our respective countries, have a tremendous responsibility for safety, for health, ensuring that we don't have monopolistic behaviors, transparency, all those things. whether they're regulating, stock market exchanges, regulating, drug design, et cetera. But the technology and the opportunities are moving so fast that, regulatory bodies and experts therein don't have that set of skill sets. So, back to your most recent comments, Taiwo, the skills that we need in regulatory agencies also need to be developed to respond to the tremendous technology revolutions and the opportunities. So I'll just give an example because it ties back also to the modeling and simulation, the use of supercomputing, high performance computing, applies to quantum, et cetera. And that is that universities and national labs who are using modeling and simulation tools at scale for many purposes have been able to deploy things. I mean, we know, for instance, that many components of a jet engine are used, they use supercomputers at GE, whatever, to model and simulate all of this. And they've been able to get some, tremendous progress in regulation to accept that data as opposed to physical testing. But in the vaccine development, what was really interesting, and is this a model or is this just a special case? I mentioned this earlier, many of these tremendous regulatory steps, sequential steps for drug design and recovery. By the time you would get to understand efficacy and safety, drug companies had spent hundreds of millions of dollars only to find out, that the molecules don't meet this, and the whole thing was thrown out. But using modeling and simulation to identify early in the process the efficacy and safety of a molecule and throw that out as opposed to go through all this was a tremendous innovation that was used in the development of the COVID. So on a public-private partnership, the U.S. Council on Competitiveness has been involved for, well over almost 20 years in making the business case for the use of high-performance computing beyond exascale across all industrial sectors. And the partnership that was very revolutionary at the time was our National Digital Engineering Manufacturing Consortium that involved, 4 major corporations, United Technologies, Deere, GE, and Procter & Gamble, who worked with our national labs and then 3 industry partners to bring modeling and simulation tools to the small and medium manufacturers in the Midwest to increase their competitiveness. And this was designed by the US Council, the White House, Department of Commerce, et cetera. And it initially started with a co-investment of companies and the government, about $2 million to start it. But it led then to the Digital Design Manufacturing Institute. And so it showed that if we could get the power of the supercomputing and simulation into the hands of small and medium manufacturers, they could become competitive, they could reduce their costs, they could become exporters, et cetera. But what was very important early on was to cut out the red tape. And that's the real point I want to make back again. The government invested, but they did not come in and be a heavy-handed regulator, stopping the ability of the innovation to occur. And so that's a real complex balance issue. But I think if we don't begin to address that in our respective countries and get some guidelines, quantum computing is a perfect example. How's this going to relate to current cybersecurity controls and regimes? And so this regulatory issue and the government's role in that component, but also as an investor in the PPPs, is absolutely critical to get right. And I think we have a lot of work to do on those dimensions.
Yeah, fabulous comments, Deborah. I'm so inspired by the example, Tapua, first of all, that you provided around the Performance Computing Consortium. And that illustrated a lot of what Deborah was saying: skills, capacity, facilitating the knowledge of these, access to the infrastructure resources, even the modeling, and the challenge around regulatory, because we need to work at speed. So it's a balance between the requirements of the components of responsibilities and accountabilities and project design, but being able to move that at speed because everything is moving so quickly. If I can segue over to Eduardo, and I just want to now shift us into looking ahead. So particularly with your background in the health sector and the great context you gave us earlier, looking ahead beyond the pandemic, healthcare systems are going to continue to be undergoing pressure to increase quality and efficiency of patient pathways and to find new ways to use data and become more integrated in assessing care needs across the continuum. And all of this, using new technologies to enhance delivery. So I'm wondering about some of your ideas around how PPP models can be used to adapt to these changes. And what do you think some of the innovative solutions, some of them maybe have been mentioned already, but what are needed to kind of align these visions and interests and priorities and design criteria? I know it's a big one, but jump into something of that because I know you have a lot to share there.
Okay, Laurie. I mean, the first thing, I would like to agree with Anwar. One thing must be clear: with a PPP project, you're not buying something. You're not just building a bridge or building a house. You're establishing a long-term partnership, usually a long-term partnership. So with this in mind, the second thing is what you want to do with this kind of contract. And when you're talking about health and in this new situation with this new scenario regarding health, at least here in Brazil, one thing is very clear. People will not accept, regarding the public health system, the lack of hospitals, the lack of bed that we had before. They said, look, when things got worse here, even though I had my private health insurance, they were not able to provide the health service for me. I had to go to the public hospital, to the public system. And I think this situation is happening in England, is happening in the whole Europe, is happening in the US. People will start to question the governments about, look, I need some basic health assistance, some basic health service. And regarding the period that we're gonna need this, the government will not have all the money, all the budget to build the hospitals, to build the service and bring in all the technology that we need in order to provide the service for the population. And one thing is that I'm observing, especially here in Brazil, especially in health here in Brazil, we are a very high regulated sector here in health, even though what kind of service, what kind of digital service can doctors provide on the internet and what their behavior in the hospitals. Most of those regulations that Deborah said came down. Look, we are facing a very new and hard paradigm due to the pandemic. I need that the doctor must be more efficient. So instead of moving the doctor around the service, let's keep him in his office and make it a teleconference or a telemedicine service, granting all the information from the patient, preserving the confidentiality, the intimacy of the patient. And I think we will not be able to expand and we will not be able to satisfy the demand of the society regarding health if we do not make public-private partnerships and changing the way we provide the service. And technologies like Tapia said, and digital technology, and collecting all those informations and using that information to build up a national health strategy. Well, look, what kind of illness will appear in the following years, because a lot of people here in Brazil are sedentary, are locked down in their house for at least 1.5 years. People are getting mental problems. What all this information, what we can do with all this information, make decisions, health decisions rely on this information. And the other thing that we must be aware all the time when you're talking about new communication technologies like 5G, like AI, like using wearables all the time to collect our information, how the companies, how the governments, how everyone who has access to my data, to my information, will use that. Am I being in a clinical trial 24/7 because I have some wearable that monitor my ECG and they know that at some point of the day I take some medicine? Transparency is going to be a key issue in this whole process, I think.
Yeah, you raised some very important parts to consider, and, it's really looking at establishing that long-term partnership that you mentioned, and what do you really want to achieve through that partnership? Recognizing that there's been so many pressures put on the existing systems that are showing kind of cracks in that systems as well as opportunities. Recognizing also that there needs to be that access to information to be able to build that broader new approach to the national health strategy. But also, there has to be balance with privacy issues and with use of data. And those are, realities, I think, that everyone will be considering, as we go forward. Roberto, maybe I will ask you to just reach into the questions for the Q of A. I know our time is running down, but I'd like to be able to have the panel address those if they can.
Sure. We have two questions here from our distinguished fellow Mike. And I think one really is about the, let's say, the difference in speed between business regulation, business and government. I think that Deborah has already commented about that. And the other one is, what is the role of PPPs in developing and promoting key technology standards? So one is, I think, what already addressed, if there are any advices that can ensure that PPPs can innovate as quickly as a single startup. It's about speed, the other one about technology standards.
There's someone that can jump in to address one or both of those?
Just a comment. I mean, the thing is to match the private time and the regulator time. I think it's an issue anywhere you go. In every single country that will have a strong regulation, especially in the sector I used to work with, which is health. It's a big issue because regulators have questions all the time. And when you think that you answer all the questions, they came up with more questions. But the thing is, I believe that if we do not have, and the COVID experience for regulation health was very clear on that. At some point, even though here in Brazil, our health agency, and in the US, the FDA, had some pressure at some point from the society. Look, I need more ventilators in the market. I need more vaccines in the market. I need new vaccines in the market. Look, you are using regulations from the 70s. We have, we can collect the data faster. We can analyze the data faster. We can analyze this data better. And we have evidence that, look, in a short term, with new approach, we can prove the effectiveness and the security of our device, of our product. So I believe that this movement, this social movement, and the engagement, the civil society is the main engine that can change the time from the regulators.
Thanks, Eduardo. Some very wise comments. Yes, Tefla.
If I may, just to speak about PPPs to promote technical standards, maybe I can just highlight some work that, for example, that we've done, which is adjacent to this issue of promoting technology standards. So on the one hand, we've actually got a policy lab where we engage with different governments around the world, just advocating for different good technology principles. And in addition, on the university side, so for example, we actually set up a ethics lab with the University of Notre Dame, just to ensure that our human values actually get embedded in the technology process. So right, not as an afterthought, but actually as part of the development process. So I think this is one of the ways that you can actually ensure that there's no sort of undesirable effect from our endeavors to develop different technology products and to innovate.
So Roberto, I'll pass it back to you as our time is waning, but I would suggest that we've just touched the tip of the iceberg on this conversation, that it was very exciting, and I think there's more to dig into, and perhaps there's an opportunity for us to collaborate into the future on some leadership thinking around this, and emergent frameworks, and moving the collaboration ahead, and opportunities for PPEs coming out of the pandemic, and new models of private sector and university and government, and that whole conversation of risk and the new kind of leadership that's needed. Thank you very much for allowing me to participate, and thank you to all of our panelists for their incredible insights.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you for moderating this. I think it's been an amazing conversation. We're kind of already finishing our session, but maybe we could go for 30 seconds each for a final message here. Starting with you, Laurie.
Well, I think the one thing that I would like to focus on is, and I just touched on it briefly, is that I think there is a new type of leadership that's needed. And that I think we need to consider how we transition from the old way of working and what safeguards we're using then, to think about some of the things that were mentioned this morning around that speed of collaboration, the access to resources, the facilitation of those moving parts is going to demand not just new leadership, but new skills.
Wonderful. Eduardo.
I agree with Laurie. I believe that there is a new scenario, especially in health, and for new opportunities for PPPs. And I think that we have, in the last year and a half, a lot of information on and a lot of experience on what works and what doesn't work. And I think if we have clearness on what are the real demands, what are the real opportunities we can do, we can make a good job. Here in the university, we are setting up a center to stimulate PPP projects on medical device and work as a soft landing area for companies who wants to try and to seek opportunities in the Brazilian market. And I think this those joint projects can make the difference.
Thank you. Tapiwa.
I think I would say that as the size, scope, and complexity of problems increase, public-private partnerships are actually required to make advances at scale, particularly when it comes to problems that we face collectively as humanity. Today, one can think of changes around climate change. And when there are certain very large national investments, I think public-private partnerships are the way to go. And we can leverage key transformative technologies to speed up the time from conception of a project to when we have some major discoveries and innovations.
Thank you, Tapiwa. Anwar.
Okay, I just continue my idea that PPP should be transformed more to the real impact investment, and it have to be more social oriented, and maybe the area of using PPP could be extended beyond just the public goods and some innovations, but especially for development country, PPP is a powerful instrument, but we need to use it with very careful in order to avoid some mistakes.
Thank you, Anwar. Deborah.
Thank you. Well, let me first thank our fantastic group of panelists for their insights, for their wisdom, and for their recommendations of how to move forward with PPPs, really, as I would like to say, the foundational and scalable platforms required for creating new futures that are sustainable, that are inclusive, and that are going to shape our world to come. One thing I would just like to add to the wonderful knowledge and wisdom and experience that came out through this discussion is that I think a critical challenge is that all partners in a public-private partnership, just from the get-go, need to understand, and they need to respect and align their different missions, their goals. We've heard this, very, very different time horizons. They have very different risk tolerance. And very importantly, they have different definitions of what is success and what is value creation. And so to really have a sustainable public-private partnership, all of those interests and needs have to somehow be both recognized but balanced to create, an end result that will have benefit and value to all.
Thank you, Deborah, for your comments and your inspiration. And just to finish here, 3 quick things. One is a GFCC tradition. We always take a picture, so we invite everybody to look at the camera. Turn on your camera. So we're taking a group picture here. We were delighted to have all of you, including my colleagues Vanessa and Riley, who are somewhere in the world around the web. So yeah, thank you for that. Second thing, my personal note here is about this dual relationship that was commented here. And you, Deborah, you kicked that. Really talking about how PPPs can drive an innovation and should be focused on the future, and including tech, and at the same time, how tech can change PPPs models and how we could use technology to change that model. And that's mediated by regulation. And this is a segue for our next session. We'll be back in 2 weeks, and the top will be regulation. So please stay tuned for the Frame the Future conversation series. This will be continued. And also, please check the GFCC website for updates and for resources. We're pulling cases and best practices for everybody and all the speakers and organizations that are joining us for these sessions.
And
Roberto,
let me thank you and the GFCC team for a wonderful session today, but I also want to, in particular, again, thank our wonderful moderator, Lori Schmidt, for taking on that role and adding so much value to the conversation. So thank you to Lori and Roberto and team.
Thank you, Deborah. And so great to be with you, Eduardo, Anwar Tapiwa, and Lori. Please, if you have any cases, any links, any best practices, share with us. We're putting together a resource page. Lori, as Deborah said, always is amazing to be with you. Thank you for helping us to make this happen. See you in 2 weeks, September the 8th, we'll talk regulation.